Good morning. It's a real honor to have been invited to speak here among such esteemed panelists and guests. As it was mentioned, about 6 years ago, I was part of a CBC quasi-reality television competition called Canada's Next Prime Minister. And we were asked to present then our vision of Canada. And so back then, I was inspired by the thrilling, fast-paced topic of interprovincial trade barriers. So my vision for Canada involved a country without trade barriers, where widgets and hay bales could travel freely from coast to coast without any extra costs or burdens. This is very exciting stuff. So today, I've been asked again to provide my vision for Canada. And this time around, I've been inspired by some equally exciting, thrilling ideas. And that's the topic of regulatory frameworks and best practices. So before you get too excited, let me explain what I mean. Just for some context, the bulk of my work takes place with foreign governments and foreign companies. And so for me, when I start to think about Canada's vision, I think about Canada's influence and our role to play in the world. Canada's worn many different hats in the international scene, and we've used many different kinds of soft power to project our power above our weight. For example, our peacekeeping missions and our role in creating the G20. I believe there's also another element of Canadian soft power that's emerging. It's not nearly as dramatic or headline friendly as peacekeeping or foreign aid, but I think it's important nonetheless. What I've noticed is a distinct shift in foreign governments and foreign companies, and generally people that live in places other than Canada, asking the question, how are Canadians doing this successfully? And how can we make it work here? And just in general, the Canadian model seems to be working well. How can we get in on this? And a lot of the time, it's about areas of Canadian success, like our stable banking system or our winning national hockey teams. Although no one is asking me these things, because I'm not an expert in either. In my world, they're asking me about energy. Companies in particular, state-owned energy companies, are asking Canadian operators all sorts of questions. How do we extract heavy bitumen and tight gas safely? How do we operate with communities in challenging countries? And governments are coming to us and asking, how can we set up frameworks that we need so that we can promote investment, protect our environment, and safeguard our stakeholders? Or more simply, they're asking, we want energy, we want to do it right, we don't want to get kicked out of office, and we don't want to mess this up. So it kind of brings me back to my original point about regulatory frameworks and best practices, which is that Canada is becoming a true expert in certain niches like energy, and we can share our examples and our best practices with the world. In BC and Alberta, we've set up industry best practices and government regulatory frameworks that have helped us extract some of the most economically and technically challenging resources in the world. And around the world, these projects and the frameworks set out to manage them are seen as world-class models to strive for. Governments around the world are asking, how can they unlock their energy potential and do it safely and efficiently? So for example, my company and other Canadian companies have explored and located and figured out how to develop natural gas buried thousands of feet below the surface up in northeastern BC. Now, this is shale gas trapped in microscopic pores buried thousands of meters below the surface that requires high pressure water and sand to extract the resource. These basins are hundreds of miles from infrastructure or towns. In the winter, they face -40 conditions and high winds. In the summer, it's a swampy bogland with mosquitoes the size of hummingbirds. To say these are challenging conditions is a huge understatement. But industries worked together and collaborated to create these best practices and figure out how to do this safely and efficiently. And provincial and local governments have collaborated with industry and figured out how to set up a framework to promote and incentivize this exploration, but also do it safely and reduce impact. And importantly, companies have collaborated with communities to make sure that they receive the local benefits in terms of revenue and employment. And why are we going to all this effort? Because there's a unique opportunity to unlock one of the largest shale gas basins in North America. And because we get excited about natural gas as the fuel of the future. It's the cleanest, cleanest burning fossil fuel and the most realistic way and first step for us to reduce our overall emissions. And what's exciting about all this is that we've created a successful model of regulatory frameworks and industry best practices for this very specific type of resource. And now, where Canada has the chance to lead, and where they are leading, and where we are taking the lead, is helping other countries figure out how to do this safely and how to do this efficiently. Because these shale gas sources are very prolific. They're on every continent in the world. They're in countries that never thought they'd be able to produce their own energy. Countries as diverse as Poland and Argentina and China and South Africa. There's 1 in 6 countries around the world has shale gas basins with strong development potential. So all these countries, they turn to Canada, and they turn to industry, and they turn to government, and they say, how can we emulate this Canadian success story? In Poland, for example, they have the largest shale gas reserves in Europe. They've just recently been discovered, and they contain about 795 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So to put that into perspective, in an average year, Canada uses about 3.2 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. So this is potentially centuries of natural gas supply from a relatively small country. And currently, Poland is completely dependent on Russia for their natural gas, and most of their power generation is coal-fired. So Poland's very excited about the economic opportunity, the geopolitical opportunity, and the environmental opportunity to reduce emissions by fuel switching. They have enormous potential, but a lack of industry knowledge on how to extract the natural gas, and a lack of government knowledge on how to set up a framework to make this successful. So Canadian companies and Alberta and BC governments were sought out from our experience and track record, and we spent many hours with Polish government officials and regulators and industry members trying to share the Canadian way, from the detailed regulations to taking them up to remote drilling sites to getting them to meet members of the community. And it's not just Poland that wants to learn the Canadian model. In fact, next week in this building, we have a delegation of Colombian officials that are coming up to learn about our industry best practices and our regulatory framework so that they can unlock their natural gas potential. And after Colombia, there are the Kiwis, there's Moroccans, there's the Kuwaitis, Mexicans, and they're all looking to replicate a successful Canadian model and learn how to extract these tough resources responsibly. This new type of soft power and influence through knowledge sharing and education, it's helping to showcase the strength of Canadian governments and regulatory bodies and Canadian companies. And it's helping show our competitive advantage, because we're often not going to be able to compete by being the biggest. But I know that we can compete on how we do things and doing things the Canadian way, whether that's an energy framework or whether that's a blueprint on how to build some of the world's most livable cities. Because if there's one stereotype about Canadians that I believe in, it's that we Canadians like helping others. And by sharing our lessons and experiences, we can help others. So my vision for Canada ties into this. Whether it's industry best practices for shale gas, or whether it's a framework for a stable banking system, or whether it's best practices on how to have an undefeated women's hockey team, Canada has a lot to teach the world, and we have a lot to share with the world, because we as a country are taking on some of the world's toughest challenges, and we're succeeding. So I would challenge everybody to think about a way that you do something successfully, whether it's in your industry or in your personal life or in sport or in philanthropy, and think about how can we share that with the world? How can we share our model of Canadian success? Because in 2017, we'll have had 150 years of learning and lessons and trial and error. So to celebrate our 150th, I think we should reflect on what Canada has shared with the world on how to do things, think about our own best practices, and look forward to the future and think, how can we share other models of Canadian success? So, thank you.